The air in the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Legacy Hotel was a suffocating cocktail of expensive perfumes and quiet ambition. It clung to the velvet drapes and settled in the hollows of the crystal chandeliers, each facet of glass refracting the light from 1,000 calculated smiles. This was the arena, the glittering jungle where fortunes were won and lost not with the roar of a predator, but with the whisper of gossip, the subtle arch of an eyebrow, the precise, bloodless cut of a well-placed remark. And tonight, Catherine Monroe was the guest of honor. On stage, beneath a spotlight that felt both warm and interrogating, she stood at a polished lectern, the weight of the Innovator of the Year award cool and solid in her hands. The award was a heavy, abstract sculpture of interlocking gears, a testament to the logistics empire she had built from the ground up, a company that was now the intricate, invisible circulatory system for half the nation's commerce. Her speech was simple, direct, devoid of the platitudes that usually filled rooms like this. She spoke of her team, of the relentless pursuit of efficiency, of the belief that a well-oiled machine could create opportunity where none existed before. And so, this award isn't just for me, she was saying, her voice calm and even, carrying across the hushed audience. It's for every driver who navigates a snowstorm to make a deadline, every programmer who codes through the night to shave a nanosecond off a delivery time, every person who believes that the distance between 2 points is not a problem, but a promise. A smattering of polite, appreciative applause began to build, and then a single voice, amplified by a nearby microphone, sliced through it. A truly inspiring story of pulling oneself up by the bootstraps. The voice was smooth, laced with the easy, inherited confidence of a man who had never needed bootstraps. Richard Davies, CEO of Davies Corp., a legacy competitor, rose from his front-row table. He held a champagne flute like a scepter, a broad, disarming smile plastered on his face. The audience, sensing a moment of light-hearted industry ribbing, chuckled expectantly. Richard was known for his roasts, a form of corporate theater that allowed him to assert dominance under the guise of humor. It's wonderful to see how far one can get with a little charity, he continued, letting the word hang in the air, weighted with insinuation. My father always said you have to know your place to appreciate a handout, a lesson some of us learn better than others. The room's temperature dropped. The laughter died in 100 throats. The jest was no jest. It was a missile, coded and precise, aimed directly at Catherine's past. The word charity was a reference to the community scholarship that had given her a lifeline after her family had lost everything. A fact she had never hidden, but which Richard had just weaponized. The mention of his father was the twist of the knife. For Catherine, the glittering ballroom dissolved. The faces of the industry titans blurred into a meaningless watercolor wash. The spotlight overhead became the harsh, bare bulb of a fluorescent light fixture in a cramped, borrowed office. 25 years ago. The smell of rain-soaked wool and defeat. Her father, a proud man who had built a small manufacturing plant with his own 2 hands, sat slumped in a chair that was too small for him. Across the desk sat Arthur Davies, Richard's father, a man whose smile was a predatory slash in a perfectly tailored suit. Arthur was explaining the terms of the buyout, his voice a soothing, condescending purr. "It's for the best, John," Arthur had said, pushing a stack of papers across the desk. "You gave it a good run, a noble effort, but some people are built for this game, and some aren't. Consider this my little act of charity, enough to get you back on your feet. Find a new place." Her father hadn't looked at the papers. He had stared at Arthur Davies, his face a mask of shattered pride. "Catherine, hiding behind a filing cabinet. A 10-year-old girl who only understood that her world was ending. Had seen the moment her father broke. It wasn't loud. It was a quiet, internal collapse. The light in his eyes extinguishing like a snuffed candle. The memory, sharp and visceral, slammed back into her with the force of a physical blow. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage of composure. The award in her hands felt impossibly heavy. On stage, under the silent, watchful gaze of hundreds. Catherine Monroe did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not allow the hurricane of rage and grief swirling inside her to betray itself on her face. She simply held Richard Davies's gaze. Her silence was a vacuum, pulling all the air and noise from the room. It stretched for 5 seconds. Then 10. The discomfort in the audience became palpable. Richard's smile faltered. The confident glint in his eye replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He had expected tears. A stammered retort. A retreat. He had not expected this. This profound, unnerving stillness. When she finally spoke, her voice was unchanged, as calm and clear as it had been moments before. "Thank you, Richard," she said, "for that valuable perspective." She turned back to the audience, placing the award on the lectern. "And thank you, all, for this incredible honor." She walked off the stage, the applause that followed her now hesitant, confused. She moved through the crowd, a phantom of grace, nodding to the few who dared to meet her eye. The whispers followed her like the rustle of dry leaves. No one knew what they had just witnessed, but they understood it was not the end of something. It was the beginning. Catherine Monroe had not just accepted an award. She had accepted a challenge. A war, dormant for a quarter of a century, had just been publicly declared. Monroe Global Logistics occupied the top 10 floors of a sleek, obsidian tower that pierced the Chicago skyline. Unlike the ostentatious, marble-laden lobbies of its competitors, the entrance to MGL was a study in minimalist efficiency. The air was cool and smelled faintly of brushed steel and glass cleaner. There were no oil paintings of founders, no mahogany-paneled walls. There was only a single, massive screen displaying a real-time map of the globe, crisscrossed by thousands of glowing, pulsating lines. Catherine's fleet of trucks, ships, and planes. A living, breathing digital organism she had willed into existence. Her personal office was a sanctuary of controlled quiet. One wall was a floor-to-ceiling window, offering a god's-eye view of the city's intricate grid, a constant reminder of the logistical puzzles she so elegantly solved. The other walls were lined not with awards or accolades, but with whiteboards covered in complex algorithms and flowcharts. Her desk was a single, uncluttered slab of polished concrete. It was here, in this sterile arena of thought, that she had built her empire. Her ambition was forged in the fire of her family's ruin. After her father's business collapsed under the predatory weight of Arthur Davies's charity, their lives had unraveled. They lost their home, their friends, their place in the world. Her father, a man broken by humiliation, faded into a shadow of himself, dying of a heart attack 2 years later. A death Catherine had always considered a quiet suicide. The trauma of that loss, the gnawing injustice of it, became the fuel for her life's work. She wasn't just building a company. She was building a fortress, a monument of success so undeniable that no one could ever again condescend to her or her family's memory. She had clawed her way through college on that scholarship Richard had so callously mentioned, worked 3 jobs, and started her business out of a garage with a second-hand truck and an unshakable belief in her own methodical brilliance. Richard Davies, by contrast, had been born on the throne. Davies Corp was an old money institution, a lumbering giant that had dominated the industry for generations through backroom deals and an impenetrable old boy network. Richard had inherited the title of CEO like a family heirloom, his primary qualification being his last name. He managed the company with a kind of board entitlement, his primary focus not on innovation, but on maintaining the rigid social and corporate hierarchies his father had perfected. To him, Catherine Monroe was an anomaly, an affront to the natural order. Her success, earned rather than inherited, was a constant, irritating reminder of a world that was changing in ways he couldn't control. His animosity was not just professional rivalry. It was the systemic prejudice of a man whose entire identity was tied to the belief that people like him were destined to rule, and people like her were destined to serve. The morning after the gala, Catherine stood before her office window, watching the city wake up below. The memory of Richard's words still echoed, a dissonant chord in the symphony of her carefully constructed life. The video has over 2 million views, a voice said from the doorway. Elena, her chief of operations and her oldest friend, stood holding a tablet. Elena had been with her since the garage days, a sharp, fiercely loyal woman who understood the unspoken language of Catherine's silences. "And the sentiment?" Catherine asked, not turning from the window. "Overwhelmingly in your favor," Elena said, swiping through the screen. "They're calling his comments classist, misogynistic, a masterclass in corporate bullying. Your handling of it is being lauded as grace under fire. You're a trending topic." "Good," Catherine said. The word clipped. Public opinion was a tool. Nothing more. "Are you okay?" Elena asked, her voice softening. She was one of the few people in the world who knew the full story of Catherine's past. Catherine finally turned, her face impassive. "I'm fine. This was predictable. Davies is a creature of habit. His father used humiliation as a business tool, and Richard learned at his feet." She walked to her desk and tapped a sequence on her keyboard, bringing up a complex file on the main screen. It was a detailed analysis of Davies Corp, its financials, its supply chains, its key personnel, its vulnerabilities. She had been compiling it for years, a contingency plan for a war she always knew was inevitable. "He thinks this is a game of social standing," Catherine said, her eyes tracing the web of data on the screen. "He's about to find out it's a game of logistics. And in that game, I don't lose." The declaration of war came 3 days later, not with a whisper, but with a calculated, brutal blow aimed at the heart of her company. Catherine was in the main conference room, a sterile glass box nicknamed the Arena, midway through a quarterly review with her executive team. The mood was optimistic. MGL had just posted another record-breaking quarter, and they were finalizing the acquisition of a smaller tech firm that would revolutionize their tracking systems. Elena's phone buzzed insistently on the polished table. She glanced at it, her brow furrowing. "I have to take this," she apologized, stepping out of the room. Catherine continued the presentation, but a knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. Elena did not leave meetings for trivial matters. A minute later, she returned, her face pale. She didn't say a word. Simply walked to the head of the table and turned the room's largest monitor to a live feed of a major business news network. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Davies Corp announces bold move in agri-sector, acquires Southern Pine Cooperative." A stunned silence fell over the room. Southern Pine Cooperative was not just some random company. It was a sprawling network of farms and processing plants across the southeastern United States. And, more importantly, it was the exclusive supplier and logistics partner for AgriCorp, the nation's largest food distributor, and AgriCorp was MGL's single biggest client. representing nearly 30% of their annual revenue. The news anchor was speaking to a triumphant-looking Richard Davies via satellite. "Mr. Davies, this is a stunning move. Most analysts weren't even aware Southern Pine was in play." Richard's smile was predatory. "We pride ourselves on moving quietly and decisively at Davies Corp. We saw a unique opportunity to create a vertically integrated supply chain, offering our clients unparalleled efficiency from farm to table. By acquiring Southern Pine, we can now offer AgriCorp a seamless, one-stop solution for all their needs." The implication was clear and devastating. By buying the supplier, Richard could now force AgriCorp to use Davies Corp for their logistics, effectively stealing Catherine's largest client out from under her. It wasn't just a hostile business maneuver. It was a targeted assassination. He hadn't just bought a company. He had bought her client's entire supply chain. Catherine's team stared at the screen in horror. Phones began to buzz around the table as alerts and frantic emails poured in. The stock price of MGL, visible in the corner of the screen, had already begun to dip. "They can't do that," one of her VPs stammered. "Our contract with AgriCorp is ironclad." "It's not," Catherine said, her voice cutting through the rising panic. The room fell silent. "The contract has a change of control clause. If their primary supplier is acquired by a direct competitor with an integrated logistics network, they have the right to terminate our agreement with 90 days' notice to avoid supply chain disruption. It's a standard clause. One I never imagined would be used as a weapon." She had underestimated him. She had expected another public jab, a social slight, perhaps an attempt to poach a mid-level manager. She had not expected him to take a multi-billion-dollar sledgehammer to the foundational pillar of her company. This was not about market share. This was about annihilation. Richard Davies was trying to put her back in her place, permanently. Catherine stood up and walked to the whiteboard, her movements calm and deliberate, a stark contrast to the frantic energy in the room. She picked up a black marker. "He just took our queen," she said, her back to her team. A very public, very aggressive move. She looked over her shoulder, and for the first time that day, her team saw the flicker of fire in her eyes, the cold, controlled fury of a grandmaster whose opponent had just made a fatal error. "He thinks he's declared checkmate. What he's actually done is left his king completely exposed." She turned back to the whiteboard and began to draw a series of boxes and arrows, her mind already mapping out a counteroffensive. The defensive war was over. The real war, the one for her father's legacy and her own survival, had just begun. Richard's next move was swift and insidious, designed to cripple Catherine's ability to retaliate. He leveraged his family's decades-old network, the shadowy architecture of favors and handshakes that propped up the city's old guard. Her immediate problem was financial. The impending loss of the AgriCorp contract created a confidence crisis. MGL's stock was in a controlled slide, and the vultures were circling. To stabilize the company and fund her counterattack, Catherine needed to secure a new line of credit, a complex and massive deal with a consortium of banks led by Sterling Thorne, a financial institution whose board was littered with Richard's cronies. The meeting was held in a boardroom at Sterling Thorne that felt designed to intimidate. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and entitlement. Catherine and Elena sat on one side of a vast, polished mahogany table. On the other sat a phalanx of stone-faced bankers, led by a man named Gerald Vance, a close friend of the Davies family. Catherine laid out her proposal with meticulous precision. Her numbers were sound, her projections conservative, her plan for navigating the AgriCorp loss logical and robust. But Vance and his team were not interested in the data. Their questions were a masterclass in passive aggression, designed to sow doubt and undermine her authority. "With all due respect, Ms. Monroe," Vance began, peering over his spectacles. Your company's recent volatility is a cause for concern. Losing a client of Agricorp's magnitude suggests a certain vulnerability in your business model. The model is resilient, Catherine countered calmly. What happened was not a market failure. It was a targeted, monopolistic action by a competitor. Our diversification strategy, which this line of credit will accelerate, is the appropriate response. An interesting theory, another banker chimed in. But from our perspective, risk is risk. And you, forgive me for being blunt, suddenly represent a great deal of it. It was a slow, deliberate strangulation. They dragged out the meeting for hours, picking apart every line of her financials, questioning her leadership, subtly implying that a woman of her background might not have the fortitude to weather such a storm. It was a coordinated, systemic blockade. Richard wasn't just fighting her in the marketplace. He was poisoning the wells she needed to survive. Leaving the meeting, Elena was seething. They were never going to approve it. That was a public execution. Richard called in every favor he had. I know, Catherine said, her expression unreadable as they stepped into the waiting car. That's what I was counting on. She pulled out her phone and made a call. Marcus, it's Catherine. We're a go. They took the bait. Marcus Thompson, a brilliant and fiercely independent investment banker who had made his name by betting on disruptors, had been Catherine's secret weapon. He ran a boutique firm that specialized in navigating the hostile waters of old money finance. He despised the cronyism of men like Vance and Davies, having faced his own battles against the establishment. That evening, they met in Marcus's office, a chaotic space filled with monitors displaying flickering stock data. Joining them via a secure video link was Sarah Williams, a PR virtuoso who had built a reputation for turning corporate crises into opportunities. She had been observing the fallout from the gala and had reached out to Catherine, sensing a larger story unfolding. They think they have you cornered, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. Sterling Thorne will officially deny your credit line in the morning. The announcement will crater your stock price, triggering covenants on your existing debt and forcing you into a fire sale of assets. Richard will be waiting to pick up the pieces for pennies on the dollar. It's a classic squeeze play, Sarah added from the screen. And they're using the media to frame it as a story of your failure. Upstart CEO falters under pressure. It's a tired, sexist narrative, but it works. So, Catherine said, looking at her two allies, we rewrite the narrative. The plan they had developed was audacious. Instead of fighting Sterling Thorne, they would sidestep them entirely. Marcus had been quietly structuring an alternative deal for weeks. A bond issuance sold directly to a consortium of international investors and tech sector venture capitalists, people who cared more about innovation and disruption than they did about Chicago's old boy network. The key, Marcus explained, pointing to a chart, is the timing. We need to announce our bond offering the exact moment Sterling Thorne leaks their rejection. We hijack their news cycle. And that's my cue, Sarah said. I've already prepared a press release and a series of interviews for Catherine. The story won't be MGL denied credit. It will be MGL rejects outdated banking system, forges new path with global innovators. We'll frame Sterling Thorne and Davies as dinosaurs, relics of a bygone era, trying to stifle progress. We'll make you the face of the future. The next 48 hours were a blur of high-stakes maneuvering. Marcus worked his connections, finalizing the complex financial architecture of the deal. Sarah prepped Catherine for a media blitz, honing her talking points into surgical instruments. Catherine, meanwhile, provided the calm, steady center to the storm, her strategic mind coordinating every move. The next morning, as expected, An anonymous source leaked the news of Sterling Thorne's rejection to the top business journals. MGL's stock began to plummet in pre-market trading. Richard Davies, watching from his opulent office, likely allowed himself a triumphant smile. And then, at 9:01 a.m. EST, 1 minute after the leak went wide, Catherine's counteroffensive launched. Sarah's press release hit the wires. A dozen pre-arranged interviews went live. Catherine appeared on the leading financial news network, not looking defeated, but looking powerful, confident, and utterly in control. "We did approach Sterling Thorne," she said coolly to the anchor, but it quickly became clear that their vision is rooted in the past. "We are a company focused on the future. That's why we are thrilled to announce today that we have secured double our initial target in a private bond offering, backed by some of the world's most forward-thinking investors. This capital will fully fund our expansion and allow us to accelerate the development of next-generation logistics technology." The effect was instantaneous. The narrative flipped. The market, which had been reacting to a story of weakness, was now confronted with a story of immense strength and ingenuity. MGL's stock reversed its slide and began to climb, soaring past its previous highs. The bankers at Sterling Thorne were left looking flat-footed and foolish, their rejection now framed as a colossal misjudgment. Richard Davies's perfectly executed squeeze play had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly, leaving Catherine stronger, better funded, and with a powerful new narrative of resilience and innovation. In her office, Catherine watched the stock ticker turn a brilliant, solid green. She had survived the first assault. More than that, she had used her enemy's own strength against him, turning his blockade into a ramp that launched her to a higher level. But she knew this was just one battle. The deeper truth of why Richard Davies was so obsessed with destroying her still lay buried in the past, and she knew she would have to unearth it to win the war. With her company stabilized and her war chest replenished, Catherine shifted from defense to a quiet, methodical offense. Her suspicion that Richard's animosity was more than just professional jealousy had solidified into a certainty. His attack hadn't been logical. It had been emotional, visceral. To understand his strategy, she had to understand his motive. She had to dig into the shared, poisoned soil of their family's past. She started not with high-tech data mining, but with old-fashioned legwork. She took a leave of absence from the day-to-day operations of MGL, trusting Elena to run the ship. Her first stop was the city archives, a cavernous, dusty building that smelled of decaying paper and forgotten history. For days, she sat at a microfiche reader, scrolling through decades-old newspapers, property records, and business filings related to both her father's company, Monroe Manufacturing, and Davies Corp. At first, it was a frustrating dead end. The official story was exactly as she remembered. Monroe Manufacturing had been over-leveraged, hit hard by a recession, and ultimately succumbed to market pressures. The Davies Corp acquisition was documented as a standard, if aggressive, buyout. There was nothing overtly illegal, nothing to raise a red flag. But Catherine was a logistician. She saw the world in patterns, and she knew that the absence of evidence could be evidence in itself. She noticed small inconsistencies. A key supplier to her father's factory had declared a mysterious, sudden bankruptcy just weeks before Monroe Manufacturing's own collapse, cutting off a vital supply of raw materials. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. She hired a private investigator, a former financial journalist named Ben Carter, a man known for his ability to follow cold, complex money trails. She gave him a single directive: find out everything there is to know about that supplier, a company called Northwood Materials. While Ben dug into the financials, Catherine focused on the human element. She found a list of her father's former employees and began tracking them down. Most were retired, scattered across the country. She flew to meet them, sitting in their living rooms, listening to their stories. They remembered her father as a fair, decent man. They remembered the suddenness of the company's collapse, the shock and confusion. And one name kept coming up, a man named Walter Sobel, her father's floor manager and his closest friend. She found Walter in a quiet nursing home in Arizona. He was frail, his memory clouded by age, but his eyes lit up when she mentioned her father's name. "John Monroe," he said, his voice a reedy whisper. "Best man I ever knew. What they did to him, it was a crime." Catherine leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What did they do? Walter, what happened?" Walter's story came out in fragments, a puzzle pieced together from the fog of memory. He spoke of strange occurrences in the months before the bankruptcy, shipments of faulty materials arriving from Northwood, their primary supplier, key machinery mysteriously breaking down. It was a campaign of industrial sabotage, subtle enough to be explained away as bad luck, but relentless in its effect. "John knew something was wrong," Walter said, his gaze distant. "He suspected Davies. Arthur Davies was always circling, like a vulture, but he couldn't prove it. Northwood, they were the key. They started demanding payment up front, changing terms. They bled him dry." This was the connection she needed. Back in Chicago, Ben Carter called with a breakthrough. "I've been digging into Northwood Materials," he said, his voice crackling with excitement. It was a shell corporation. It had no real assets, no other clients. It was created 6 months before it started supplying your father, and it was dissolved the day after Davies Corp acquired Monroe Manufacturing. "Who owned it?" Catherine asked, her voice tight. "That's the million-dollar question," Ben said. "The ownership was hidden behind a series of offshore accounts and trust funds. But I found a name on one of the incorporation documents. A signatory. A lawyer named Elias Vance." "Vance," Catherine repeated, a chill running down her spine. "Yeah," Ben said. "Ring a bell." "His son, Gerald Vance," Catherine said slowly, "is the banker at Sterling Thorne who just tried to sink my company." The pieces were clicking into place, forming a dark, ugly picture. This wasn't just a business rivalry. It was a conspiracy, a multi-generational vendetta. Arthur Davies hadn't just outcompeted her father. He had orchestrated his destruction. And now, Richard was continuing his father's work, using the same networks and family connections to try and destroy her. The final piece of the puzzle arrived in a manila envelope from Ben. It contained a single, faded document he had unearthed from a box of archived legal files in a county courthouse basement. It was a copy of a property deed, redacted in several places. It was the deed for the land on which her father's factory had been built. But Ben had managed to get an unredacted copy from a different source. The original deed showed that, decades ago, before her father had bought it, that specific parcel of land had been owned by the Davies family. A handwritten note in the margin of the old file, penned by a long-dead county clerk, read A. Davies contesting sale. Claims ancestral right. Dispute unresolved. Arthur Davies had believed that land was his. Her father had built his dream on soil that Arthur felt was stolen from him. It wasn't just business. It was personal. It was tribal. It was a deeply rooted, irrational obsession that had been passed down from father to son. Catherine sat alone in her office, the city lights a cold, distant tapestry beyond the glass wall. The unredacted deed lay on her concrete desk, illuminated by a single lamp. Beside it were Ben's reports, Walter Sobel's testimony, and the timeline of the sabotage, the truth, in its entirety, was laid out before her, stark and brutal. Her father hadn't failed. He had been murdered corporately, financially, spiritually. Arthur Davies had not been a competitor. He had been an assassin. He had used Northwood Materials as a weapon, secretly creating it to infiltrate and sabotage her father's company from the inside. He had supplied faulty materials, disrupted production, and then engineered a cash flow crisis. All so he could swoop in and buy the company for pennies on the dollar, reclaiming the land he believed was his birthright. The charity he had offered her father was the final, sadistic twist of the knife, a performance of magnanimity to mask an act of pure evil. And Richard had known. He must have known. His lifelong mission, his constant condescension, his obsessive need to keep her in her place. It wasn't just arrogance. It was fear. He was the keeper of a dark family secret. He had spent his entire life watching her, terrified that she might one day rise high enough to uncover the truth and seek justice for the profound crime his family had committed against hers. His attack on her company wasn't just an attempt to eliminate a rival. It was a desperate, panicked act of suppression. He was trying to bury her before she could unearth the bodies. A wave of grief, raw and overwhelming, washed over her. It was a grief she hadn't allowed herself to feel for 25 years. The image of her father, slumped and broken in that borrowed office, returned with agonizing clarity. She finally understood the depth of his despair. He hadn't just lost a business. He had been gaslighted, manipulated, and systematically destroyed by a man he had once considered a peer. The shame had killed him. The grief slowly hardened into something else, a cold, diamond-hard resolve. This was no longer about business. It was no longer about proving herself. This was about retribution. This was for her father, for the name he had lost, for the life that had been stolen from him. She pulled up the file she had been compiling on Davies Corp for years. It was no longer a contingency plan. It was a battle plan. She began to cross-reference her own research with the new information, seeing everything through a new lens. The financial inconsistencies in Davies Corp's reports, that had once seemed like simple accounting tricks, now looked like evidence of a long-running pattern of fraud. The network of shell corporations, the offshore accounts. It wasn't just about tax avoidance. It was the machinery of a criminal enterprise. Arthur Davies had built his empire on a foundation of lies, and Richard had inherited it all, the wealth and the sins. The fight had changed. Her objective was no longer to survive Richard Davies. It was to dismantle him, to tear down his corrupt empire, brick by fraudulent brick, and expose the truth of his family's legacy to the entire world. She would take everything from him, his company, his reputation, his name. She would do it not with sabotage and secret dealings, but with the one weapon he could never counter: the truth. She would give her father the justice he never received. This was her sole purpose now, the singular focus of her existence. Catherine's investigation, now armed with a clear target, intensified. With Marcus's financial acumen and Ben's investigative skills, she began to follow the intricate money trail that led back from Northwood Materials. They discovered that the fraud hadn't stopped with her father. It had become the Davies Corp business model. For decades, they had used a network of shell corporations to manipulate markets, strong-arm suppliers, and hide fraudulent activities. Somehow, Richard sensed her closing in. Perhaps an old family ally tipped him off. Or perhaps he simply felt the ground shifting beneath him. His response was not to retreat, but to launch a scorched earth attack. He weaponized the media, leveraging his connections to unleash a vicious, public smear campaign designed to destroy Catherine's credibility before she could use it against him. The first article appeared in a respected business journal, headlined "The Cracks in Monroe's Empire," a story of ruthless tactics and questionable ethics, citing anonymous former employees. It painted a picture of Catherine as a tyrannical leader who exploited her workers and cut corners on safety. It was a collage of half-truths and outright fabrications, expertly woven together to create a damning narrative. The attack was relentless and multi-pronged. Bloggers on the Davies Corp payroll published stories questioning her company's environmental record. Doctored photos appeared online, appearing to show unsafe conditions in MGL warehouses. An employee rights group, secretly funded by a Davies Corp subsidiary, staged a small, media-friendly protest outside her headquarters. The campaign was brutally effective. The public narrative that Sarah had so carefully crafted Catherine as the innovative disruptor was being systematically poisoned. Her allies started getting nervous calls from their own boards. Investors grew anxious. The tide of public opinion, once so firmly in her favor, began to turn. The attacks weren't just on her business. They were on her character, the very foundation of her identity. Catherine found herself in a war on two fronts. By day, she, Marcus, and Ben worked in secret, piecing together the evidence that would bring down the Davies empire. By night, she and Sarah worked to combat the firestorm of lies, issuing press releases, fact-checking fabrications, and trying to hold back a tidal wave of disinformation. The pressure was immense. She was being attacked, judged, and vilified in the court of public opinion for sins she had never committed, while the man who had orchestrated it all positioned himself as a pillar of the community. The breaking point came when an article was published detailing her humble origins, twisting the story of her scholarship into a tale of calculated manipulation. It insinuated that she had used her background as a sob story to gain unfair advantages throughout her career. It was a deeply personal, cruel attack, designed to invalidate her entire life's work. It was Richard's voice, channeled through a journalist, telling the world she didn't belong. That evening, in her office, Catherine finally let the mask of composure drop. She stared out at the city, the weight of the fight pressing down on her. The lies were beginning to stick. The doubt was creeping in. Elena entered quietly, placing a cup of tea on her desk. "Don't let him win, Cat," she said softly. "This is what he does. It's what his father did. They don't create. They only know how to destroy. They poison everything they touch." Catherine turned from the window, her eyes burning with a renewed, cold fire. Elena was right. This was the Davies way. They couldn't compete on merit, so they resorted to character assassination. Richard wasn't just trying to discredit her. He was trying to break her spirit, just as his father had broken her father's. "He won't," Catherine said, her voice quiet but absolute. "He thinks he's created a storm I can't weather." She looked at the mountain of evidence they had compiled: the bank records, the incorporation documents, the sworn affidavits from former Davies employees who had finally agreed to talk. He has no idea about the hurricane that's about to hit him. She would endure the storm of lies, because she was no longer just fighting for herself. She was the vessel for her father's justice, and she could not fail. The annual Nexus Summit was the Davos of the American logistics and tech industries, held in a cavernous, state-of-the-art convention center. It was a gathering of the most powerful players, a place where multi-billion-dollar deals were born and industry trends were set. The keynote address was the week's main event, a platform reserved for the Titans. This year, the honor belonged to Richard Davies. It was the perfect stage, a captive audience of the entire industry, thousands of live-stream viewers, and a global media presence. Richard, feeling secure and triumphant after his successful smear campaign. Saw it as his coronation. Catherine saw it as his execution. She sat in the third row, a picture of calm composure in a simple, dark blue dress. Marcus was 2 seats down, his phone in his hand, ready. Sarah was in the control room, having used her PR credentials to gain access. A quiet Trojan horse inside the enemy's walls. Ben was in a car outside, coordinating with a team of lawyers. Richard took the stage to thunderous applause. He was in his element, radiating confidence and privilege. The massive screens behind him displayed the Davies Corp logo against a backdrop of soaring eagles and mountain peaks. His speech began with the usual corporate platitudes about innovation and leadership. Then, he turned his attention to the challenges facing the industry. In today's competitive landscape, he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity, it's not enough to be successful. One must be successful in the right way, with integrity, with a commitment to ethical principles. We've seen recently what happens when ambition is untethered from a moral compass. He didn't mention her name. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. This was Catherine's cue. She sent a single text to Marcus, now. Marcus typed a command into his phone, on the massive screens behind Richard. The Davies Corp logo flickered and was replaced by a high-resolution image of the Northwood Materials Incorporation document, with the signature of Elias Vance circled in red. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Richard, momentarily thrown, glanced behind him. A flicker of panic crossed his face before he masked it with a forced chuckle. Ah, a few technical difficulties. It seems... But then the screen changed again. This time, it displayed a complex flowchart, a spider's web of shell corporations and offshore accounts, showing a direct line from Northwood Materials to a holding company owned by Davies Corp. Marcus, with Ben's data, had mapped the entire criminal enterprise. Richard's face went pale. His words faltered. As I was saying. The next slide appeared a scanned copy of a bank statement showing the final payment from Davies Corp. To Northwood Materials, dated the day after the acquisition of Monroe Manufacturing. The exact amount was what Arthur Davies had cynically called his charity. It was the money he had used to buy her father's silence and his own soul. Sarah, start the feed. Catherine texted. From the room's powerful sound system, a new voice emerged, overriding Richard's microphone. It was a recording of Walter Sobel, his frail voice made clear and powerful by audio engineering. It was sabotage. Walter's voice echoed through the vast hall. They sent us bad parts, messed with the machines. Arthur Davies destroyed John Monroe. He did it on purpose. The audience was in stunned silence. The livestream cameras zoomed in on Richard's face, now slick with sweat. He was trapped, exposed under the glare of 1,000 lights and 1,000,000 watching eyes. Catherine stood up. All eyes in the auditorium turned to her. She walked calmly to the aisle and began to speak, her voice steady and clear, needing no microphone in the tomb-like silence. For 25 years, she began, Richard Davies and his father have operated under the cover of a lie. The lie that my father, John Monroe, was a failure. The truth is that he was a victim. He was a victim of corporate sabotage, of fraud, and of a deeply personal vendetta. Slide after slide appeared on the screen, a relentless, methodical presentation of irrefutable proof, forged supply manifests, sworn affidavits from former Davies employees confirming the scheme, financial records detailing decades of similar fraudulent activities against other small companies. She was dismantling his family's legacy in real time, with the cold, undeniable precision of a legal brief. Richard was speechless, a statue of crumbling arrogance. His empire was evaporating before his eyes. Catherine had saved the final, most devastating piece of evidence for last. It was a copy of a letter, handwritten by Arthur Davies to his lawyer, Elias Vance, recovered by Ben from a box of old, forgotten case files. In it, Arthur confessed everything, gloating about his victory and the reclamation of his ancestral land, outlining the entire conspiracy in his own arrogant hand. It was the final nail in the coffin. It would not only ruin Richard, but would posthumously brand his father a criminal. She gave Sarah the signal to display the letter. Her finger hovered over the send button. Her revenge was seconds from completion. And then she saw her in the front row. Tucked away near the side was an elegant, white-haired woman. It was Eleanor Davies, Richard's mother. Catherine remembered her from her childhood. A kind, gentle woman who had always brought cookies to their house. A woman who had been friends with her own mother. She looked lost, confused, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. She had clearly known nothing of her husband's crimes. This final piece of evidence, her husband's own words confessing his villainy, would not just ruin her son. It would shatter the memory of the man she had loved. It would devastate an innocent person. In that split second, with the entire industry watching, Catherine faced a choice, not between victory and defeat, but between two kinds of victory: total, annihilating revenge that would scorch the earth and harm the innocent, or a measured, precise justice that held the guilty accountable while sparing those caught in the crossfire. She looked at Eleanor Davies's anguished face, and she saw the ghost of her own mother. She thought of her father, a man of integrity. What would he have wanted? She lowered her phone. The letter never appeared on the screen. She had enough. She had already won. His financial crimes were exposed. His company was finished. She had proven her father was a victim. She didn't need to salt the earth. "The evidence speaks for itself," she said, her voice ringing with a new kind of authority, the authority of someone with immense power who chose to wield it with restraint. "I have presented this information to the SEC and the Department of Justice. They will handle it from here." She turned and walked out of the auditorium, leaving behind the ruins of an empire and a stunned silence that was more damning than any accusation. She hadn't just won. She had shown what true strength looked like. It wasn't about destruction. It was about character. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The Nexus Summit imploded. News of the scandal spread across the globe like a digital wildfire. Davies' corpse stock became worthless overnight. By the time Catherine reached her car, federal agents were already on their way to seal Richard's office. He was detained for questioning before he could even leave the convention center. In the quiet sanctuary of her hotel suite, Catherine met with her team. The mood was not triumphant, but somber, reflective. They had won, but the victory felt heavy. "You could have buried him completely," Marcus said, looking at her with a mixture of awe and confusion. That letter would have ended any possibility of a comeback, for him or his family's name, forever. "And it would have destroyed his mother," Catherine replied, looking out at the city lights. "She was my mother's friend. She knew nothing. My father wouldn't have wanted that. This was about justice for him, not about becoming the same kind of monster that destroyed him." Sarah, who had been monitoring the media feeds, looked up from her laptop. "You made the right call. Catherine, the narrative isn't just about his crimes anymore. It's about your principles. They're calling your decision an act of corporate statesmanship. You didn't just expose a villain. You set a new standard for leadership." Her decision to hold back the final blow had reshaped the victory. It was no longer a simple story of revenge. It was a story of moral clarity. She had demonstrated that it was possible to be both powerful and principled, to win without losing one's soul. Her reputation, once assailed by Richard's lies, was now forged in the fire of a public moral test, emerging stronger and more respected than ever. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and media inquiries. Richard Davies was indicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and market manipulation. The empire his father had built on a foundation of crime crumbled into dust. Catherine, however, retreated from the spotlight. She let the justice system do its work. Her focus shifted. The war was over. Now, it was time to build. She instructed her legal team to begin the process of acquiring a certain piece of property, a piece of land that had just become available through the bankruptcy proceedings of Davies Corp. It was an old, abandoned factory on the industrial outskirts of Chicago, a place of ghosts and painful memories, a place she intended to bring back to life. 6 months later, Catherine stood on the cracked concrete floor of the old Monroe manufacturing plant. The air was thick with the dust of decades and smelled of rust and damp earth. Sunlight streamed through shattered panes of glass in the high windows, illuminating the cavernous space where her father's dreams had once thrived, and then died. But today was not about the past. All around her was the sound of rebirth, the buzz of power tools, the shouts of construction workers, the beep of surveying equipment. She had bought the factory, her father's factory, and was pouring millions into its restoration. The signs outside didn't say Monroe Manufacturing. They read the John Monroe Center for Innovation and Opportunity. It wasn't going to be a factory. It was going to be a state-of-the-art logistics training hub and a tech incubator for underprivileged youth, funded entirely by a new foundation she had established. It was a place where new dreams could be built on the ashes of the old. She was not just reclaiming the land. She was consecrating it, transforming a site of tragedy into a source of hope for a new generation. She was rewriting the end of her father's story. Elena stood beside her, holding a set of blueprints. "He would be so proud of you, Kat," she said softly. Catherine looked at the vast, empty space where the main assembly line used to be. "This isn't revenge anymore," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, profound peace. "Revenge is about the past. This is about the future." True empowerment, she had realized, was not in tearing down what was wrong, but in building what was right. Her assistant approached, holding out a single, cream-colored envelope. "This just arrived by courier. Ms. Monroe?" The envelope had no return address. Curious. Catherine opened it. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, and the handwriting was elegant, feminine. "Dear Ms. Monroe, there are no words to properly apologize for the devastation my family has caused yours. I have spent the last 6 months learning the truth about my father and my brother, and it has broken my heart. My mother and I knew nothing, but that is an explanation, not an excuse. I cannot change what was done, but I can ensure the cycle ends with my generation. I have liquidated my inheritance from my father's estate. I am donating it all, anonymously, to foundations that support small businesses destroyed by predatory practices. It is a small gesture, but it is all I have to offer. What you did at the summit, holding back that letter to spare my mother, was an act of grace I will never forget. You won with honor. My father and brother built an empire on a legacy of hate. You are building one on a legacy of hope. Thank you for showing us there is a better way. Sincerely, Eleanor's daughter." Catherine folded the letter, a sense of final, quiet closure settling over her. The war was truly over. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. She looked out at the bustling construction site, at the foundation of something new and good rising from the ruins. The cycle was broken. The future was a blank page. And she was ready to write it.